very hard act to follow, and the only compensation is that I was asked to talk about the future, and I was also asked to speak slowly for the translation. So I'm not retarded, I'm just speaking slowly for the translation, if I remember to speak slowly. The question I was asked to address is, of course, a very important question for what we are doing here. Is the one state a utopia, or is it a possible reality? And any good prognosis needs a good analysis. Like in medicine, if you do not analyze correctly the disease, you are going to administer the wrong medicine. And I don't think I have much to tell you which is new with regard to the analysis, but maybe just to clarify 3 out of many major obstacles from turning the utopia of one state into reality. In brackets, I would say there's nothing wrong with the utopia, but for the people on the ground, the people in the refugee camps, in the exilic communities, we have to make sure that we are moving towards a new reality and not just talking about it. The 3 major areas that seem to be standing in the way of a one-state solution are the following. One is an international coalition of actors, of government, even individuals, who seem to be obsessed with the idea of a 2-state solution, regardless of the realities on the ground. When I talk about a powerful coalition, I do not only mean, but of course I do mean as well, the position of the quartet, which represents a very important part of international politics, the EU, Russia, the United States, and the United Nations. But even if you go to countries such as Brazil, Cuba, China, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, certain countries in Africa, the official position, even of countries who do not have diplomatic relations with Israel, is that the only way forward is a 2-state solution. It is a formidable coalition also because some of the conscientious voices of our time are also supporting strongly the idea of a 2-state solution. I can mention 2 of them, Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, but there is a longer list of people who would see, as they wrote themselves, a conference like this not only as advocating the wrong solution, but actually undermining the chances of peace, as Noam Chomsky wrote in an article in the New York Review of Books, if I'm not mistaken, 3.5 months ago. So that's a formidable coalition, because it's not just political powers in the world, in the region, but also in the world of philosophy, morality, and civil society. The second obstacle is that something that I looked for a good phrase, but then my friend Jon Snow from Channel 4 in Britain, I think succeeded in articulating it very well in a meeting we had in the LSE in London about 2 weeks ago. He talked about media fatigue with Palestine. He said that, as those of you who don't know, he's a broadcaster in Channel 4 in Britain, and he said none of the leading TV channels in the West are interested in covering Palestine anymore. They don't think it interests anyone. They don't think the events there compare in their intensity, in their veracity to what's going on, for instance, in Syria. And therefore, unless we will have a dramatic event like the Mavi Marmara or an Israeli assault on Gaza, we are not going to attract anyone's attention to what goes on in Palestine. So the media fatigue, if you want, or the comparative situation with other areas of conflict and bloodshed is a very formidable obstacle in pushing any new debate about Palestine. The third problem is that the political powers on the ground in Israel and in Palestine, in both, or in historical Palestine, that is in the pre-67 borders, in the occupied territories, and to a certain extent in the politics of the camps, are also regarding a two-state solution either as the necessary evil or the only game in town, and would feel that any discussion on a one-state solution is going to miss the historical opportunity to solve the conflict, and if not solve the conflict, at least to end the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So the political elites, as we know them, locally, regionally, and internationally, are wedded to the idea of a two-state solution, and they are wedded to this idea with the notion that actually it's almost there, around the corner, but somehow they're missing an element, a cement, a glue that put things together so that that solution would become a reality. And it's very difficult to convince people that actually there is no such corner, and there's no such glue, and there's no such medicine, and what they are offering at best is an aspirin for a cancer, not a treatment. So how do we tackle at least these three formidable problems? And as I said, I'm sure there are others. I decided to choose those three as an example of how one can move forward, to my mind, with the hope that similar ideas can also be generated about other obstacles. So I'm not claiming that these are the only obstacles. I see them as very formidable obstacles. The obstacle of the international, regional, and global endorsement of the two-state solution has to be challenged, I think, and is already being challenged by introducing a new language. Not only in small circles, not only in closed doors, but insisting that this new language should be spoken loud and clear in the German parliament, in the British parliament, in the United Nations, whenever one appears on mainstream media, whenever one is teaching a course in a university, or one talks to one's friends in one's workplace. It is time to use the words that I think we are using here, but the question is, how do we introduce the dictionary that we have to other people, not just to ourselves? How do we introduce Zionism as colonialism to a very sober and intelligent community in the world that would say to you, colonialism has ended. We are in the 21st century. Maybe there's imperialism, maybe there's neo-capitalism, but colonialism, this is something that happens in the past. And it's very difficult to convince people in the 21st century that a 19th century idea is actually still implemented on the ground in Israel and Palestine. Some colleagues of mine were beginning to use the idea of settler colonialism, which is better than colonialism, because settler colonialism is a movement that not only did not intend to leave the colony, but quite often succeeded in assuming the identity of the colonized place, or at least try to do it. Usually the only way of doing it, as they did in Australia, in North America, in Latin America, is by genociding the native people. That's the way to assume the identity of the people you have colonized. The people of Palestine were not genocided, they struggled, and therefore the Zionist settler colonialism has to face the genuine identity of the country also in the 21st century. But we have to use these terms of settler colonialism, and we have to explain that the Palestinian movement is an anti-colonialist movement, and even tell people that in some cases, bearded anti-colonialists are not Che Guevara, but are Muslims. That's also possible. And it's very difficult for the Western world to accept that people who are devout Muslims should receive from the left the same respect as the secular resistance fighters received from us in the 1950s and the 1960s when they were part of the Viet Cong, the FLN, or the movements in Latin America. We need to introduce to the world the complexity of the reality in the Middle East without differentiating between the honor we feel towards people who struggle against occupation, colonization, and dispossession according to how much they are believers or not believers in that or other religion. Anti-colonialism, colonialism is a universal perception. And if we succeed in putting Israel in the corner of a settler colonialist state, an apartheid state, a pariah state, then at least the language, if not the reality, would begin to reflect the reality, which as a historian I can tell you is a preliminary stage before you change the reality. So I don't think that we in Stuttgart have a formidable, or we are going to build a formidable international coalition that would be equal in its power to the international coalition that supports the two-state solution, but we do have our means of introducing a different language to the reality and try to use our positions as journalists, as academics, as people in every walk of life to try and educate those around us, not to use terms like that there is a conflict between two national movements. There is an idea that both sides are equally responsible for what goes on. It's very important to use the language of imbalance between the invader and the invaded, the colonizer and the colonized, the occupier and the occupied, and using the language, the universal language of human rights and civil rights would make it clear, I think, for people why any attempt to have this paradigm of parity is an attempt that helps to continue the evil on the ground, not to change it. The second problem, the media fatigue, I think is a formidable obstacle, because in order to realize, even in a media soundbite, what goes on in Palestine, you have, unfortunately, for a 20th century consumer of media, you have to know history. That's very difficult for someone who sits with a remote control and moves from one news station to the other. The moment they hear history, they move to the next station because they want to know what's happening now in the world. That's why they are paying money to the cable TV to know what's going on now, unless they are amateur historians and they're interested in history. But you cannot understand the evil in Palestine if you think about yesterday. If the only thing that you have to report is about a routine day in a refugee camp among the Nakab people or under the occupation and even under the siege of Gaza. It's a very different story if you can find the media way of telling people that day is located in 100 years of evil. And that's why nothing in the world compares to that, because of the duration of that evil, because of the fact of the millions that are being victimized by that evil for such a long time, and that the evil itself is constantly denied as being something else. And I think that is up to the media and to us who work with the media to find a way for representing any day in Palestine as a point on a continuum of dispossession. I can do it in a book. I can do it in a series of 10 lectures. But how can someone in a television studio do it with 5 minutes coverage of Palestine? But we will have to find the way, because not only changing the language about the reality is important, but also changing the representation of the reality is important. The last obstacle, of course, is the most difficult one. The existing political outfits, and it doesn't matter whether it is the Israeli political party system, whether it is the Fatah and the Hamas, whether it is the political elites of the West or of Southeast Asia or Africa, or whether it is the way the United Nations organization engages with the issue of Palestine. They are all geared to deal with the issue of a solution through the two-states prism. We have a real problem there. Now, we understand, of course, instinctively and intuitively that in order to build a solution that is contrary to the vision of the political elites, you need to build a grassroots movement that supports your idea. But that takes a long time. And in the meantime, the powers that be have a different pace that creates realities which make your idea even more difficult to implement. I don't have a magic solution for that, but I think Yoav gave us some indication of how we work in Israel with a grassroots solution. We know, he mentioned rightly that actually in the Gaza Strip there is far more advancement on the ground for the idea of a one state more than any other place in Palestine today. It's not surprisingly that outside of Palestine, the grassroots movement, like this meeting, is taking off and expanding. But I think that we should not give up of change from within as well. I think we should create a lobby for one state inside the PLO. I think we should create a lobby for one state inside the Fatah and the Hamas. I think we should create a political party in Israel that should talk about the one state as a platform for elections. We should not give up any piece of the puzzle which is called the reality in order to introduce the idea. Because, as I said, the opposition is so formidable, we have to be present in many places as we can with this idea. The last thing I would say, that of course we cannot envisage in clear terms how the one state would look like, because we are sometimes defeated ourselves by the knowledge of how difficult it is to reach that moment. If you talk about something as a utopia, you don't even begin to experiment with what it means. And the experiment is something that nobody can deny us. Whether the experiment is writing even a tentative constitution together, whether the experiment is living, as we are trying to do in Palestine, together, having a joint educational system in a place which demands segregation of the educational system. Whether we are talking about joint social and economic venture in a place that believes in apartheid and segregation. Sometimes it's very difficult to expect this to happen. One can fully understand why so many people in the West Bank are against what they call tadbi', normalization. They don't want to have any dialogue with any Israelis about any peace, and one can fully understand where it comes from. But you will not be able to begin and envisage a one-state solution if you're not going to begin and experimenting with it, despite the fact that it's not going to happen tomorrow. The very experiment on a small scale creates the model of the future. And I will end by saying that in the historical analysis of the fall of apartheid, people tend to forget, because for activists it's not such an important issue, but people forget to mention the main reason, not the main reason, one of the main reasons apartheid fell. And that was the collapse of the Soviet Union. No anti-apartheid movement would have convinced the Reagan administration to join the sanctions on South Africa had the Soviet Union still be in place. And no sanction campaign against South Africa would have been successful had not the United States joined it. The moment it was clear that one cannot claim that you can support South Africa because it's an important ally in the Cold War, it was at least easier to drag screaming the Americans into the sanction campaign against South Africa. Now, I don't know what is the fall of the Soviet Union or the fall of the Soviet Union moment for us. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, and even if I did, it wouldn't properly function. But it's very clear that some things happen beyond our reach. Not everything we do creates new realities. Sometimes we have to be there, and that's far more important, to be ready for new realities. Is it a financial crisis in the United States? Is it a successful Arab Spring? Is it a stupid Israeli war? I don't know. There's nothing we can do about it. None of us, as far as I know, I don't know all of you, but I think none of you is that powerful in the world to be part of these dramatic earthquake events. But we should be prepared. And with this I will end, maybe it's my pathetic life as an anti-Zionist activist in Israel, where usually there are more people on the podium than in the crowd, that I remember the one friend of mine that had some good ideas of how to prepare for the future when you feel a little bit imbalanced, a little bit weak compared to the world, you know, apart from the famous Thai sentence that if you feel weak, you think about an elephant that is closed in a room with one mosquito for the whole night. But that may not be inspirational enough for you in Germany, maybe because you don't understand how lethal mosquitoes can be, and we do in Palestine. But I was thinking about my friend Maxim Ilan, a poet, a publisher who died a few years ago, who self-exiled to Paris when Golda Meir became prime minister, like so many of the anti-Zionists, and came back after the Oslo Accord thinking wrongly that something fundamental is going to change on the ground. And he decided to publish a newspaper called in Hebrew Mit'an, which means load, but also an explosive load. And I helped him to finance this newspaper. We had more writers than readers. And he insisted on publishing that paper on a very expensive paper, quality. And he was hardly finishing the month. He was very poor. And I said to him, Maxime, I don't understand. It's you and me who write and you and me who read, more or less. Can we not publish it on something cheaper so that you will have a decent meal in the end of the day? And he said, you don't understand anything about history, do you? And I said, no, that's absolutely true. And he said, when the Zionist regime would fall, and it will fall, unfortunately, he said, I don't think peacefully. It will fall violently. In the ruins, people would look for ideas of what to do next. And only newspapers with good quality would survive to tell people of our thinking about the future. Thank you.